So welcome to this session on conflicts of interest and normative science. Is it a problem in environmental science? Spoiler alert, yeah, this is why we're having the session. So on behalf of myself, Valerie Forbes, and my co-chair, Tim Canfield, I want to welcome you to this session. Our additional co-chair, Christine Lehman, unfortunately couldn't be here today, so Tim and I will be holding down the fort. And with that, I would like to invite Tim to come up and give the first presentation.
Well, as Valerie gave you the spoiler alert that it is a problem, we can go right to questions. Any questions? As you can see, you've seen the title of our talk here, and we're each from three of the different sectors for the society. And we tried to balance this talk with a tripartite nature because although we bring different perspectives to the table, we have a lot of overlap in our concerns about putting out the best science in the society, and we realize there's lots of challenges and lots of work that needs to be done. So part of the rationale for this session came about because of the concern that's out there about potential possibilities of bias and conflict of interest. You see this in articles that are in Science and Nature, for example, but lots of other journals as well, including our own. And a number of our members have put out papers for quite a few years, kind of laying the groundwork for some of this effort as well. And you can see some of these papers here. They're not all recent. Some are older. These are all older in time, but these are all very well respected and very, very highly thought of members of our society. And they've been talking about some of these things for quite a while, and not all with the same perspective, but they bring their perspectives to the table, and all of them are valid. We've also had some talks in the past at different sessions that CTAG has had, which talked about this kind of normative science component, bias and conflict of interest. And we had a session in Salt Lake City which specifically targeted this with the idea that they were drawing perspectives from academia, government, and industry. So we put this session together to kind of follow up on this and also to kind of keep this discussion path and chain alive, because we still think it's very important and we still have a lot of work to do with it. Now, frankly, when we look at our science, it's all about the integrity of our science for any one of us, regardless of the sector we come from. We have the common goals when we're using science that, we propose hypotheses and we collect information. We try to do it in an unbiased manner, and we try to have that data to be relevant and informative. We evaluate these hypotheses that we put out, whether actually traditional or strictly putting them out or kind of in the background, of whether or not we're finding information that is either supporting or not supporting these hypotheses. And we use science as a tool to understand the environmental processes, environmental systems, and then we use it to evaluate impacts. And first and foremost, we're looking, to try to see whether or not there are anthropogenic impacts, but we also need to articulate and find out if there are things that are naturally occurring, whether we were here or not. Are these going to happen whether we impact them or not? We may not be able to change those things, but we may be able to change, and hopefully we'll change the things that we are causing impacts with. When we share our data, we want those data to be used by our fellow scientists. We want them to value that because they know that we're putting this information together with the best possible intentions behind it and producing the best, or as we can, most unbiased as possible science. And we want our data to be held in high regard, regardless of the sector affiliation we come from. I had some thoughts when we started to put this session together, and as a spoiler alert that Valerie said, I realized in some ways, I thought I was pretty good on areas, but in reading a lot of stuff and talking with some of you out in the audience, I have to admit, I guess I'm a biasaholic. I have biases that it's not healthy in certain things, and so I'm going to have to work on that just like probably everybody else does. But the first step in doing that is admitting, for me and probably others, that yes, I have bias. And so does it affect what I put out there? Bias can manifest itself in a lot of different ways, and you'll see some talks here in this meeting here, which talks about bias, but they're meaning things like, they found that in the equipment they were using, there was a consistent bias, or the methods that they were using, there might have been a bias that they didn't think of before or didn't know, and so they look to try to correct that. Then we have human bias, which is a little harder to ferret out and to combat. And we have conflicts of interest, and it can be impugned that, well, your funding source provides a conflict of interest to you. It may or may not. Your employer has interests, so are you, biased by the interests of your employer unduly? Most of us all have bosses. Even if we work for ourselves, we answer to somebody. There's confirmation bias. People tend to, as humans, we tend to say, I've worked on this thing. I believe this stuff because I've produced data myself. And then when somebody finds data that's contradictory to that, your first response is, wait a minute, I'm not sure I trust you. But we need to maintain open minds, because they may be right. And even though we did the best we could at the time and felt we were right, maybe new information has come to the table that we didn't have before, and it does change the perspective. And then there's the normative bias component, where behind the scenes we have a preference for a certain outcome, and so in how we decide what studies to work on, or how we interpret things may have that bias in the background, and that may not be realized that we have that bias. Typically the two scientific approaches are the descriptive or empirical science approach, which looks to collect data in an unbiased manner, objectively with measures, and it records facts, and it really is designed to be objective. What is happening? What is it? Whereas the normative science, it still has those components. But, you have these other things, and some of it comes out in the words that you see used, when you're evaluating what you see, good, bad, that's a values-based perspective that's put on this information. And so, although you do have the what is component, there's also that additional, well, yeah, but what should it be? What do we think it ought to be? That becomes a values basis. So, we started, when we started talking about this, using this as kind of our background component on what normative science is, and attributed to Lackey. And there are some people in this room that really like the work he's put out, and there are some people in this room that have maybe alternate views or different perspectives on that, and that's fine. And out of this, became this whole thing about, white hat bias, because there seems to be this easily acceptable thing that, yeah, we have bias, but you know what? It's usually the business sector. It's not the rest of us. But then when you see bias, and they said, well, all right, well, white hat bias, a distortion, of the information based on a perceived kind of, well, we really have a righteous goal at the end or something like that. And this really came out of the child obesity work back in 2010. And I had a discussion with a very respected, and I'm not shining him on because he's in this audience, but, on this here about the white hat bias, and I work for EPA, and said, well, aren't you impugning your own agency because you have policy components out of the agency, and so you have something in the background that maybe you're looking at. Why don't you talk about black hat bias? And so I looked for it, and nowhere is it defined. And I think the reason is, and this is my speculation on it, and maybe it's my bias too, that to call it black hat bias, you have to impart a design malicious intent right from the front. And I don't think I've never met anybody in this society in my 27 years that I could say, oh, they have a malicious intent in what they're doing, regardless of what sector they work for, with. So I think I'd like to take all of these off the table and not have it white hat bias or not impugn why people are doing stuff. But frankly, if we are having bias in our work, and normative bias, where we have a policy preference, that could be a policy preference from any one of us from any sector, because we think the outcome is really good for society. So what fuels some of this normative science, normative science? There's personal bias that could be political in nature, or how you view the environment, whether, you view it something to be used or something to be protected. And, it shows up in every sector. It's not limited to one sector. Now, some people may think, and some of you in the audience may be thinking, nah, I think it's in this sector, but not my sector. That's the part where I think we all have to take a look in the mirror and say, all right, it's easy to point out where, I think I can see where you're wrong, and I think I see where you're wrong, but I don't see where I'm wrong because I never look in that mirror. Funding, you hear that a lot. Well, whoever you're getting your funding from, that causes you to have bias. And it can, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're still working honestly, but you get impugned for having a bias just because of that funding source. There's career building in every every sector, every agency, whether it's academia, government, or industry. And so some of the, in the academia world, the publisher perish, things. There are things that have been published and a lot of retractions, and getting more and more lately that, it's the pressures that are out there, but it's all something that develops this bias. There's two last things though, but there's peer pressure from colleagues. If I wanted to step out here and say, I just decided I wanted to come clean, and I really don't think that this global climate change is real. I don't think it's there. I'm pretty sure there's going to be a lot of negative reaction from people in this audience, not even where they want to have a discussion about it, but how can you be so stupid? We have things in science that we won't even talk about. We've decided that all of that has been decided long ago, so we don't even need to talk about it. And so then people sometimes don't say what they truly think because it's this fear of demonization by their colleagues and friends. So how does this impact our science, or how does normativity impact our science? Well, some of it what we choose to work on. You choose to work on things that you value. How do you interpret your data? Normative words. I didn't come up with these. I'm pulling these from papers and things that I've read from others who put this together. Improved or desired, degraded, disappointing. I mean, those are all value-based or judgments onto the wording versus things that change, they alter, increase, decrease. Those are more neutral type of wordings. How do we review other people's research? Do you look at one sector, and if you look at the authors, you go, oh, they're from that sector. I'm not so sure I trust this right off the bat before you even look at anything. Does it agree with my work? When something agrees with your work, your first initial reaction is, oh, this is pretty cool. I must have done some pretty good stuff. If it disagrees with work you did before, you're going, I don't know if they're really right because I'm pretty sure I was right. Again, sources of funding, names associated with the research, the publication journal. I mean, everybody strives, in one level, I want to publish in Science and Nature because somehow those have been elevated to the very top. And I'm not demeaning those two journals, but I want everybody here to publish in ET&C, IEAM, because I think that's a top journal. But there are people that, say, I want to go to Harvard or Yale. They've got some cachet, but is it really earned or not? I don't know. How do others and non-scientists use our data? Well, if we start mixing empirical science verbiage and policy preferences, it confuses them. They don't know who to trust. And as Lackey put out there, he says it's easy, but it's wrong for scientists to become stealth policy advocates. So if you're advocating a policy, be honest up front and say, I really prefer this policy. I've done the work to kind of support that. So the reflective questions we ask, or we should ask, is normative science a part of environmental science? Tying in with the spoiler alert, yes, it is. We're seeing it all over the place. It's not just us coming up with this. Everybody's coming up with this. It seems to be pretty pervasive across the sciences. If you look at it, is it only isolated in one sector? I think what we found, in our looking, the answer is no. It's prevalent across all sectors. There's lots of finger pointing, and I can point a finger at every one of you out here, but 3 fingers are pointing back at me. That's the part where I have to look in the mirror. What is my bias in all of this when I'm trying to do stuff? Should we be concerned? Yeah, we should, because it attacks, if we have bias in this problem, then we have the potential of being labeled fake science. If somebody points out where we weren't perfectly honest, that takes away our credibility. It impugns our integrity. It doesn't impugn our integrity just on one sector. It impugns the integrity of the entire society. And then we have a loss of public trust, so they don't come to us when they need help. So how can we address this problem? Well, there are a number of ways, and by no means am I the person who should make all these decisions on this, so we need to do this collectively. We can provide guidance to journal reviewers. What is normative talk? What is normative, terms, so we can look for some of this stuff. We might want to write and publish a position paper, to the editors that they can use to help, refer people for guidance. It's easier to point out the normativity in others, but harder to recognize it in ourselves. One of the first things to recovering from being an alcoholic is admitting that you're an alcoholic. I think one of the first things to recovering from being a biasaholic is admitting that I probably have some bias there and I need to look at it and take care of it. No sector's free from normativity. Again, because I don't think anybody does anything with a malicious intent. They may think that, by doing this over here and increase jobs and things like that, even though it's at the cost of maybe a wetland over here, that's a positive thing. It's not doing it because they hate wetlands, not because they don't care about the environment. It's a different value perspective. We feel the best way to address this is in a tripartite approach. That's why we put this talk together with 3 of us from the sectors. I'd like to propose out here that we create an interest group focused on this. We don't have an interest group on that now, but it would take a lot of us to be involved in this. I think this is the way we address this. And then we can provide written guidance back to our members about what to look for, maybe how to address this, and how to address it in our own work and how we move forward. So with that, I'll take any questions. I don't know how to turn that off.
Okay, we're in our 5-minute movement period, so anybody who needs to change rooms, please do so. But if there are any questions while we're changing slides.
Is that mic working there? Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that if we have a specific interest group, it would be elevating it to a little more visible status, and then it might also be viewed as a little more inclusive and inviting for people who want to be involved. And as we always tell people, there's no groups that are exclusive. You want to go to any interest group or join any group, walk in and join it, and your perspective is important and valuable. Well, as the opening slide had the disclaimer on the bottom, I don't speak for the agency, and I'm pretty sure that I don't know where they're going with this as a corporate entity. All right, we do have bias and integrity statements, and they strive toward that from a corporate standpoint. But I think it also takes those of us who work with the EPA actually implementing it and putting it on the ground, and then holding ourselves and our colleagues accountable to that. I agree with you. You don't ever get rid of bias, but if you can be as transparent as possible up front, then you don't lose credibility if somebody finds out later you had some agenda behind the scenes, and then they're wondering what else you haven't told them or you've held back. So I think you're right. You can't get rid of it all. We can strive to do that, but transparency has to be part of this if there is that bias at the table. Exactly, that's a valid point, but it's kind of like a baseball game. You can be a fan, you can be an umpire, you can be a player. You have to be clear about which hat you're wearing, because you cannot wear more than one hat at the same time. You can wear a different hat at different times in the process, but be clear about what hat you're wearing at that time so somebody doesn't take that you're pulling from a different perspective.